Hey guys, I want to start off with a little bit of good news. A friend has introduced me to a new program that will hopefully allow me to combine these lectures with the PowerPoints in a video so that you will basically be able to see the PowerPoints while I'm lecturing. Now, some of you are probably thinking, oh God, no, 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 please no, period. But you actually probably might enjoy it more, and you might get more out of it and make better scores. So we're going to do that. For now, we're going to begin Unit 7, which is the Emergence of Modern America, 1898 to 1929, on page 423. And the unit introduction begins, have you noticed as you got older that you have more and bigger responsibilities? As the United States grew and developed in the early 1900s, it took on more and bigger responsibilities. As its interests expanded, the country became concerned with the affairs of other nations. It also took responsibility for its own citizens and resources in good times and in bad. In this unit, you will learn how America took wider responsibilities in the world. You will learn about American involvement in smaller wars and in World War I. You will learn how America took responsibility to give one half of its citizens the right to vote. You will learn about America's economic crash after a period of great well-being. So basically what we're dealing with tonight is the Spanish-American War, and then we're going to move on to World War I, and then we're going to move on to the Roaring Twenties. All right. On page 424, we have Chapter 22's introduction, America Becomes a World Power, 1898 to 1913. Throughout the 19th century, the United States played a limited role in world affairs. Important European nations did not think America was a world power. This changed late in the century. Confidence as a nation, new American leaders, and new world problems brought the United States into the world picture. In this chapter, you will learn how America became a world power. Our goals for learning are to explain the reasons for and the outcome of the Spanish-American War, to describe American expansion in the Pacific and how the United States became a stronger nation, to describe the accomplishments of President Theodore Roosevelt, and explain several reforms that were made during this time. Okay, so we open our Chapter 22 PowerPoint, and the first thing you see is this eagle on the cover page. And the eagle stretches his wings from Puerto Rico all the way to Hawaii. This was actually a cartoon critical of America's expansion, from what I've been told, during this time period. This is when the eagle began to stretch his wings. This is when we began to step out as a world power. Some people didn't like that. Some people felt that we were basically becoming as imperial as any of the old powers of Europe. And if you've ever heard the complaint that, America is the world's policeman and that we shouldn't be, well, this is when it more or less begins. It begins now, and in Chapter 23, it'll take another step forward with America's involvement in World War I, and then Chapter 26, World War II. That's when we really step up and become probably the greatest power the world's ever seen. But for now, all right, we click the slide, and we look at the Spanish Empire before and after 1898. At its height, 1790s, you can see on the left-hand side in red the Empire of Spain at its height. You see Spain itself just above Africa, that little red blob. That's Spain itself. And all throughout Africa, Europe, and the Pacific, you can see little traces of red here and there. But if you look at the Americas, almost all roughly about half of North America and about a quarter of South America was dominated by Spain. And this, of course, happened during the age of exploration when the conquistadors came in and subjugated most of that territory. You also see, the islands of the Caribbean under Spanish dominance. But after 1898, let me rephrase that. By 1898, everything has changed. Spain's empire has pretty much fallen apart. They have just a little bit left. They still control the Caribbean. They still have a tiny little bits of Africa here and there. They have the Philippines in the Pacific and a few of the Pacific Islands here and there. Cuba is our focus of interest. You see it circled there. If you click the slide, we move on for reasons for the Spanish-American War. Cuba is at this time still under Spanish domination, and it's an island of the haves and the have-nots. There was the very, very wealthy and the very, very poor. The Spanish don't have really the Spanish aristocrats, let's say that, controlled pretty much everything that could make money on that island, and the native Cubanos, they pretty much worked for pennies on the dollar. We talked about the exploitation during the age of the robber barons in factories. Arguably, it's worse in Cuba. There's not even really a pretense of rights. Big corporations ran Cuba, more or less. You can see from the $1,000 mark or $1,000 bill there on the bottom of the slide, the Eastern Cuba Sugar Corporation is the one putting out the money. The Republic of Cuba's got very little to do with it. America had a lot of business interests in Cuba. We were involved in oil, sugarcane farms, tobacco plantations. It was also a tourist hub. People would go to enjoy the tropical climate. They'd live in fancy hotels. They'd go to casinos and gamble. Cuba's big income source, however, was agriculture. And there were many Americans living on Cuba as part of the business there. All right. Now, you were seeing more and more native Cubanos rising up in rebellion against these people who were exploiting them in no uncertain terms. And America became involved in this not 100% out of any sense of altruism, not because it was the right thing to do to help out the natives, but because at least half of their interest was their monetary interests in Cuba. There was a lot of American money tied up in Cuba, and they didn't want that disrupted. All right. The president during this time period, we click the slide, is William McKinley. He's number 25. We talked about him being elected in 1897. You can see he's a one-termer. All right. And he approaches Cuba, he approaches the government of Spain several times with different ideas as to how to protect American business interests, American citizens, and to help the Cubanos out. Tries to negotiate with the Spanish government, tries at one point to buy Cuba from them. None of this works. We click the slide and we see the yellow journalism. We see Joseph Pulitzer and William Hearst. Think the tabloids you see click the slide. All right, you see the tabloids, National Enquirer, The Globe, In Touch, all these crazy stories you see in the checkout line at the grocery store that don't have a grain of truth to them, but they're in those bright, screaming yellow letters designed to get your attention and make you buy that newspaper. All right, click back to the previous slide. This yellow journalism, this tabloid journalism, as it's called, was created by Pulitzer and Hearst, the owners of the New York World and the Journal. These two guys were less concerned with the truth of as it was printed in their newspapers and more concerned with selling newspapers. And the war between Spain and America that's going to develop, a lot of people lay the blame for that war at their feet. They would publish these crazy stories in their papers that were not necessarily full-blown lies, but they came pretty darn close, basically accusing the Spanish government of every crime known to humanity and saying that the American people had a responsibility to rise up and do something about it. Now, some historians, a lot of historians, look back on this now and say they really didn't have that much to do with it. They might have influenced opinion in the New York area, but not nationwide. But still, they did have an impact in it. All right. So we'll click past the tabloids and we'll click to the actual newspaper headlines that they put out. And you can see the sort of nonsense that they were printing in their papers. Spanish ships on our coast. All right. Yes, there were Spanish ships on our coast, cargo ships and passenger liners. All right, but both houses in an uproar, threatening revolt. Warren McKinley. Well, the houses are almost always in revolt because Republicans and Democrats hate each other's guts. That kind of a thing. Just basically printing headlines that skirted the truth. They weren't full-blown lies, like we just said, but they get pretty darn close. And all it was just florid headlines and designed to make somebody buy the newspaper. All right. Public outcry in America gets loud enough, and big business, their correspondence with the government gets loud enough, and certain politicians who, have an interest in this situation, they get loud enough that eventually President McKinley orders a American warship, the USS Maine, and you can click the side, you can see the Maine, to go to Havana and show the flag, as they say, basically just to make its presence known, let the Spanish government know, hey, we're here, we're keeping an eye on things, behave, all right? And that was all that was supposed to be. She pulls into the harbor at Havana, and she's there for a few days, and click the slide, and she blows up, all right? Now, they look back on it, and people theorize it. Was it possibly a Spanish attack? Maybe, but most people think not likely. Most historians look back on it and they think it was an accident. Maybe her magazine, her weapons cache, maybe that something happened and it blew. Maybe her boiler room blew. Something happened. In any event, the ship explodes while in Havana Harbor. And people automatically assume that it was an attack by the Spanish. And Pulitzer and his buddy, Hearst, they jump on this and grab it with both hands. And you can see the headline on the next slide. Destruction of the warship Maine was a work of an enemy. They don't actually accuse Spain, but they basically say it was an enemy. And they offer a $50,000 award for the detection of the perpetrators of the Maine outrage. Anybody who can bring us evidence as to who did this will pay them $50,000, which 1898, that was a good chunk of change. Assistant Secretary Roosevelt convinced the explosion of the warship was not an accident. Roosevelt almost wants it not to be an accident. We'll talk about that in a minute. All right. The Journal offers $50,000 reward for the conviction of the criminals who sent 258 American sailors to their death. Naval officers unanimous that the ship was destroyed on purpose. A little bit fudging of the headlines, all right? But you get the idea. They whipped the American public into a frenzy over this. Click the slide and we see a button with a little motto that became very popular in this time period. It's an American flag, and you could open it up, and on the inside of the flag it says, "To hell with Spain, remember the Maine." Another headline from one of the newspapers, of the Journal, I believe, "Crisis is at hand, Spanish treachery." Again, just making the situation worse with their crazy headlines. Eventually, it comes to a head. All right. The president is under tremendous public pressure to ask Congress to declare war on Spain. They debate for a week, and on April 19th, 1898, they declare that Cuba will be an independent nation free from the Spanish Empire. The Spanish just kind of like, whatever. On April 25th, McKinley signed the declaration of war with Spain, and Congress freely unleash the troops. We are at war with Spain on April 25th. All right? We were ready to go on this. We were pretty much already prepared. Teddy Roosevelt, who was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and like I said, he pretty much wanted this war. Roosevelt wanted us to stop being viewed by the rest of the world as a third-rate agricultural experiment. That's almost a direct quote. He wanted us to become a great power in the world. And as a result, had poured tremendous amounts of money in the U.S. Navy. After John Quincy Adams, he's probably, the second president to really be regarded as a patron of the Navy. In any event, thinking that maybe this was going to turn into a shooting war, Roosevelt ordered a fleet of our most advanced warships to go to the Philippines under the command of Admiral George Dewey. The fleet enters Manila Bay in the Philippines, and then they received word that we're at war with Spain. This fleet of our best warships takes on a small fleet of Spanish clunkers, like just junk, and it's not even much of a fight. We very quickly send them to the bottom of Manila Bay. 20,000 American troops arrive in the Philippines, and we very quickly, with the help of the Filipinos, who didn't love the Spanish, seize control of the Philippines. All right? The title there, A Splendid Little War. This was a phrase that was coined, I believe it was, no, it wasn't McKinley. Who was it? I'll remember in a second, and I'll tell you who coined that phrase. But it's a phrase that has always just irritated the life out of me. You should never call a war splendid, all right? For whatever reasons. Click the slide. We also sent a warship, the USS Virginia, to Guam. It's a tiny little island out in the Pacific. And the governor of Guam didn't even know we were at war. He sent an envoy to the Virginia to ask her officers to come to the colonial mansion, governor's mansion, and have dinner with him. And they were like, well, sure, we'd love to, but here's the thing, we're at war. Oh. And the governor of Guam promptly surrendered. And then apparently they had dinner. All right. So we took Guam with, virtually bloodless. But the Cuban campaign, that is the story that everybody knows. Particularly, click the slide, the story of two of the units that fought in this war, two regiments. The 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry, called the Rough Riders, and the 10th U.S. Cavalry, called the Buffalo Soldiers. All right, click slide. The Buffalo Soldiers was a unit of all-black cavalry, formed after the Civil War. Very experienced Indian fighters, one of the best cavalry units in the entire Army. At first off, there was a lot of protest against them. Usually, white officers did not want to serve with the 10th. But any officer who was willing to serve quickly found out just how good they were. And usually they came to really love the regiment. In particular, one man who's serving in the regiment right now, Captain John Pershing, is going to be a big wheel. Pershing's going to keep coming back up in future chapters. He'll eventually get the name Blackjack Pershing for his time in the 10th. All right? Click slide. And then you've got the Rough Riders, the 1st Volunteer Cavalry. This almost sounds like something out of a movie when you hear how the Rough Riders were formed. Roosevelt retires, or not retires, but resigns as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy to join the Army and form this cavalry regiment, the 1st Volunteers, or the Rough Riders as they'll come to be called. Roosevelt grew up old money in New York socialite. He was chief of police for New York City at one point. Then his first wife died, and it just about killed him. Roosevelt had always been an outdoorsman, loved the outdoors, and he went out west. And you can see him in this slide wearing, a buckskin outfit, holding a rifle, to try to put himself back together. And in doing so, he fell in love with the West. Every aspect, every part of it, he fell in love with it. So when he calls for volunteers to form this new cavalry regiment, the first thing he does is he puts a friend of his who's regular Army, Colonel Leonard Wood, in actual overall control. And Roosevelt takes second in command because he's not dumb. He realizes, I'm not a professional soldier. I don't know what to do yet. Leonard, you run the show and I'll learn. All right? He calls for cowboys, vaqueros, bandits, for God's sake. You name it. Any sort of Western stereotype you can put on somebody. If you could ride and shoot, you could probably get into the Rough Riders. Oddly enough, there were also a bunch of New York socialites, people who were family friends of the Roosevelts who thought, hey, this is going to be a great idea. Let's go join up with Theodore's regiment and have fun. Lunatics, but, young people are dumb sometimes. No offense. These are guys with names like Michelin, as in Michelin tires, all right? Tiffany, as in Tiffany Diamonds, Vanderbilt, all right, so on and so forth. And this was just a bunch of young men who thought this was going to be a heck of a lark, all right? The Rough Riders are trained to be a very unorthodox regiment, but they do come together, and they actually do prove to be very effective, all right? Click slide. The invasion of Cuba begins on April 25th, 1898, and lasts till December 10th, 1898. It is a, how shall I say this politely, cluster foul-up from the get-go. Getting the troops organized in Florida is a bit of a mess, but eventually it does get done. The commanders of this army, interestingly enough, are all old vets from the Civil War. You've got guys who fought for the Confederacy and fought for the Union in this army, commanding these soldiers, which I've always found fascinating. The troops are landed at Las Guasimas they're landed at Daiquiri on June 20th. There's a fleet of Spanish warships there. It's a repeat of the Philippines. They're very quickly sent to the bottom of the Caribbean Sea. And from there, you can look at the slide on the bottom. Troops are landed. And again, it's a mess right from the get-go. There are a number of battles. Some of them are accidental. The Americans find out real quick, we weren't ready for this. We thought we were, we weren't. In particular, malaria proves to be absolutely devastating for the American troops. We lose more probably to a malaria than we do anything else. And later, when we win the war, the Americans will send in an army doctor to basically do away with yellow fever, or malaria as it was called, in Cuba. Walter Reed. There'll be a famous hospital named after him. You may actually hear about it. If you watch the news, it's usually one of the places where the president ends up going if the president is sick. The battles culminate with the taking of San Juan Hill and Kettle Hill. The 10th Cavalry, along with a number of other units, were sent to attack Kettle Hill. The Rough Riders and a couple of other units were sent to attack San Juan Hill. All right. Now, you guys, if you click next slide, you'll see it says it's a black screen with 240. It's a movie. It's an entire giant embedded movie. Really, what we would do is we would just watch the movie if we were in class from about 240 to about 255. 15 minutes, but still, there's that 15 minutes. And that is the taking of Kettle Hill, and San Juan Hill. You guys have the liberty to watch the whole entire movie, and I actually encourage you to do it because it is a good movie. The guy who is playing Roosevelt, Tom Berenger, nails him. It's a fun little flick. All right, I'll skip over that. Well, I don't know. Maybe I'll watch some of it. Let's see. Two hours and 40 minutes. All right. And at 2 hours and 40 minutes, you see the assault on the hills. The Rough Riders are taking Kettle Hill. The 71st New York and the 10th are taking, trying to take San Juan.
Hey, put your two guns under the hot. You men, leave those positions alone. Get down on the wall. Forward defensive perimeter. A return fire on the Sundown Heights.
So, you get the idea. Skipping ahead a little bit. Skipping ahead to around 250. And they've taken the 10th and the 71st take San Juan. The Rough Riders leave Kettle Hill to assist them. And Roosevelt now is, Roosevelt went into this wanting this war, not just because he wanted America to become great, because he wanted, as he put it, to see the elephant. He wanted to feel battle sting. He was a lot like some of those young guys from New York. They thought, he thought it was something that he, as a man and a leader, should have experienced. And what you see here at this point, he's seeing the real price tag of it. He's been seeing the real price tag of it all throughout the movie. And he's understanding, it comes with a price. And he sits down, takes his hat off. I've always wondered if the flag flying next to the word empire was supposed to be symbolic of something. And the soldier from the 10th comes up to Roosevelt.
It's all right, Colonel. It's all right. It'll never be the same.
And it never was. Just by way of note, the subtitles you see on the at the bottom of the screen, that's Portuguese. This is a bootleg copy of the movie. Anyway, Roosevelt says it'll never be the same, and it never was. You click the slide. Outcome of the Spanish-American War, 1898. The Spanish lost all of their holdings in the Caribbean and in the Pacific. The French step in and negotiate the Treaty of Paris between the United States and Spain. We gain control of Guam and Puerto Rico. Cuba will eventually be given its independence. The United States will keep the Philippines as well, paying off $20 million worth of debts that technically we already owed the Spanish anyway. But some people look at it and say that we bought the Philippines for $20 million, plus the American lives that were spent fighting this war. Click slide. The Filipinos thought that they were going to be granted their independence after this war was over. That turned out not to be the case. During the war itself, the Filipinos had helped us out, expecting we would grant them their liberty. We didn't. And many Filipinos rise up in rebellion against us. They didn't want the Spanish and they didn't want us. This rebellion will last about 2, maybe 3 years, and it'll cost hundreds of thousands of Filipino lives. The estimates vary, but it averages out to be around 400,000. Now, admittedly, most of that was due to famine and disease. but still, 400,000 lives is 400,000 lives. 5,000 American soldiers died, and a lot of this was, again, due to disease. Eventually, in 1901, we put down the rebellion, and the leader of the rebellion, Emilio Aguinaldo, swears allegiance to the United States. And we will keep control of the Philippines until 1946, so about 45 years. And on July 4th, Independence Day, we grant the Philippines their independence after the end of World War II. All right? Cuba becomes a military territory of the United States. Click the slide. Leonard Wood, commander of the Rough Riders, is put in charge of Cuba and made the military governor of Cuba. We write a new constitution for Cuba, which includes something called the Platt Amendment, which says that we will give Cuba their independence as long as the United States can establish a permanent military base there, and that we can change the government as we see fit. You're independent, but you got to do what we tell you to do. Oh, and the base, you can actually see it right there on the slide. The base that we establish is Guantanamo Bay, which, of course, is still there to this day, and it's where we keep terrorist prisoners. All right? Cuba isn't really independent. It's what we call a protectorate. Their policies are set by the country that controls them, and in this case, that's us, the United States. Any sort of trade or business that Cuba wanted to do with another power had to be approved by the United States. And in exchange, we offer Cuba the protection of the United States. Right? This will be the policy right up until the 1960s, really. 1950s, 1960s. Right? So you can debate pretty easily whether we went into this to spread democracy, as they say, to promote American values, as they say, or was this enlightened self-interest? Was this the best move we could make for America in terms of our politics, our economy, and our military? I'll let you think about it, do your own research, and decide for yourself. All right, we click slide. Now, there were some loud voices who did not like what we were doing in this war. And you see again the cartoon of the eagle spreading his wings from the Philippines to Puerto Rico. A lot of people believe that what we were doing was completely contrary to American ideals. You know, this is supposed to be the land of liberty and independence for us to go and impose our will on other cultures, other countries. They believe that was completely contrary to what we needed to do. And two of the loudest voices against this were Andrew Carnegie and Mark Twain. We've discussed them in previous chapters, and this is entirely in keeping with my opinion of these men and what I've learned about them and their beliefs. But plenty of other people believe this was not only a good thing, it was a necessary thing. There was a belief in the inherent superiority of American culture. We believe that if we were going to expand our economy, we'd have to open it up to new markets in the East, specifically China and Japan. And if we were going to be able to ensure security for the nation, we would have to be able to project our military strength, which in this time period and still to this day was primarily done by the Navy. We would need to be able to establish overseas bases from which we could operate the Navy. So between the economy, I hate to say the word arrogance, but you kind of have to. You know, the inherent belief that we're as Americans we got the right to do this, and our military interests, we did this. All right, including taking over Hawaii. I'm not even going to try to say her name. I always try to say it, and I always butcher it, so I just call her Queen Lili. In 1891, there are, in a very similar situation to what was going on in Cuba, powerful business interests that controlled farms and plantations throughout Hawaii, a lot of agricultural business, coffee, amongst other things more than anything else. Were trying to exert power over Hawaii. And Queen Lili, the last queen of Hawaii, did not want them there. She would have given anything she could do to get the Americans out of Hawaii, or at the very least get them under control and not so exploitive of her country. Taking a cue from what was going on with Cuba, these American business owners hired mercenaries and influenced Hawaiians who were, in their pockets basically, to rise up in revolt against the Queen and to take over Hawaii. And in 1898, the American government officially acknowledged Hawaii as a U.S. territory. This one, there's not even really any sort of excuses that you can make. This isn't like Cuba or the Philippines where, there's an arguably tyrannical power exploiting the native population. In this particular case, we were the tyrannical power exploiting the native population, and we took Hawaii. We just took it. All right. Next slide. Now, we just mentioned that moving into the Asian markets would be tremendously beneficial for American technology. Excuse me, not technology, but for the American economy. On the one hand, we would be able to, as you see Uncle Sam carrying all that stuff, be able to export to China and Japan tons of American-made products and American technology, and in exchange, you can see what they are offering. All the natural resources that we could get from the Asian countries. And there, the caption at the bottom, and after all, the Philippines are only the stepping stone to China. All right, click the slide. There's a small problem. The old European powers are already in China, and they and Japan have pretty much carved the country up like a pie. You can see the cartoon there. You've got from left to right, Queen Victoria, the Kaiser. I'm not sure who the other leaders are, but basically England, Germany, Italy, not Italy, but Russia, France, and Japan are carving up China. And, the Chinese emperor is protesting, but there's nothing he can do to stop it. And if you look at the map on the left-hand side, you can see how it's broken down by color into the territories that the European and Japanese powers controlled. Down towards the south, you've got, the French in control of what's going to become Vietnam. The British have control of the Yangtze River Valley and Tibet. The Russians have got northern Mongolia. Japan has got its little annexed chunk down there by Formosa. And the Germans have got their little chunk up there by Tsingtao. They didn't want the Americans in here because, they've pretty much already got this whole thing sewed up. And they're making a tremendous amount of money controlling the goods and resources of, southern China. Click slide. That was it. John Hay. Secretary of State John Hay is the one who coined that phrase, splendid little war. And probably he's another one who helped manipulate that war into being. But anyway, McKinley and Hay push forward something that they call the open door policy. You can see Uncle Sam, a giant Uncle Sam dwarfing the European powers surrounding him, and he's got a key. And on the key, you can look, read it. There's an inscription. I have to put my glasses on to read it. American democracy is the key to opening the way to China. And you can see the China on the outside of the door. There's China. Uncle Sam's got a big grin on his face. What the open door policy was supposed to do was to counter the influence that these European powers had in China. Each foreign nation would allow the other nations to trade freely in each other's spheres of influence. Basically, it wouldn't be, this is my little area, only I can do business here. Anybody would be able to do business there, including America. And this would allow us, like we just said, to get access to all the lucrative money-making resources that were available in this area. Tea, spices, silk, and would create a huge market for us to sell American-made goods. All right. Now, the Chinese, no one's really asked them what they wanted in all this. They resented all these foreigners, in their country, telling them what to do, running their country, exploiting their resources. Eventually, this culminates in what we call the Boxer Rebellion. Really, the word they should have used was dojos. At various martial arts clubs and dojos, Chinese men were organizing, trying to think of ways that they could get the foreigners out of their country. And in the spring of 1900, there was a huge rebellion, and they called it the Boxer Rebellion because, again, all these guys were organizing and operating out of dojos. And for a little while, it looked like they were, going to be able to inflict some real damage on the European forces. And then in the spring of 1900, Japan and the European powers poured troops into China and utterly and ruthlessly and brutally crush this rebellion. You can see the pictures here. You've got Japanese and Russian troops working together in the top slide. You've got Japanese and British troops working together in the lower slide. It didn't take very long for them to completely crush this rebellion. Hay steps in and negotiates between the two sides. Eventually, peace is worked out, and the open door policy is pushed through. All right, which basically gives the Chinese people more autonomy in their own country. I'm not saying that was the end of European exploitation. That probably won't happen to the end of World War II. But things do get better. The election of 1900 rolls around, and McKinley versus William Jennings Bryan. You remember him from the last chapter. This time he's running for the Democrats. He was running for the Democrats this time, but this time without quite so much populist support. McKinley is a successful wartime president. He's riding a popular wave of support. On terms of electoral ballots, he beats the doors off of Bryan, 292 to 155. The popular vote is a little closer, 7 million to 6 million, but still, he clobbers him. And it doesn't hurt that his running mate is the war hero, Teddy Roosevelt. All right. So this will basically begin McKinley's second term, and you can see on the next slide, you can see the breakup of the vote. The Democrats took the South, the Republicans took the North and the West. All right. Click slide. Not just a few months into his presidency, McKinley is shot by an anarchist named Leon Czolgosz. I probably mispronounced that name terribly, but we're going to call him Leon. They had actually gotten word that an attempt was going to be made on the president's life, but McKinley ignored it. He went anyway. Leon fires 2 shots. One of them hits, but it hits deep. The crowd again catches the guy, and they nearly hang him on the spot. He hangs on for a while. There's even an attempt to find the bullet with an early model metal detector, but it doesn't work. Click the slide. McKinley passes away. Roosevelt was not with him when he was shot. He was in, I believe, McKinley was in Buffalo, New York. I can't remember where Roosevelt was. But in any event, when word is brought to him, Roosevelt is apparently very emotionally traumatized by it. Swears the oath of office. and becomes the 26th president of the United States, 1901 to 1909. I won't kid you. Roosevelt is a controversial president. Some people hate him. I grant you there's some things about him that are not exactly nice, but at the same time, he's the sort of leader who you realize this is the guy who's going to get stuff done. You may not like how he does it, but he's going to get it done. All right, so let's explore that. Click slide. His first trial as president comes in 1902 with the anthracite coal strike. Surprisingly, for a guy who was old money New York and a Republican to boot, the Republicans basically have always been pro-business, at least at this time period they have been. Roosevelt intercedes in this humongous coal mine strike in 1902. 140,000 coal miners in Pennsylvania walk off the job, demanding increased wages, a 9-hour workday, and the right to establish a union. The mine owners are pretty much refusing to bargain. Roosevelt steps in as a mediator, calling both sides to come to the table and to talk and to settle their problems. The little quote there at the top, the labor union shall have a square deal, and the corporation shall have a square deal. And in addition, all private citizens shall have a square deal. Square deal means a fair deal. And this phrase, square deal, becomes one of the hallmarks of Roosevelt's presidency. Now, after this, Roosevelt successfully negotiates between the two sides. And, like every good compromise, nobody gets everything they wanted, but they all basically got something. After this, it kind of sets a precedent that the federal government will step in and mediate between striking unions and their employers. All right. I'm going to take a little break to get a drink because I'm getting cotton-mouthed. I'll be right back. Okay, so we're back, and we are talking about Roosevelt's presidency. Now, unexpectedly, if you click the next slide, it'll say progressives. Roosevelt was something of a progressive. We talked about the progressives, in the last chapter, and the reforms they wanted to make in government and how business was done. The progressives are still around today. A lot of people point at Bernie Sanders and they call him a progressive. The progressives had certain things that they wanted to see happen. They wanted direct primaries. They wanted basically for the voters, the individual citizens, to choose their party's candidates. Amongst this, they wanted senators to be chosen by popular vote, not state legislatures. They wanted voters to be able to put bills before the legislature, directly address their governments, and let them know what they wanted, as opposed to only members of the legislature being able to introduce bills. They wanted voters to be able to vote directly on bills instead of only legislators being able to pass laws. And they wanted to be able to recall officials who were not doing their jobs. If they were not doing their jobs or they were corrupt, they wanted the power to fire them for all intents and purposes. And so we head in this direction under Roosevelt. Some of the stuff we do get, like the 17th Amendment allows for U.S. senators to be chosen directly by the people. And you see the power of the vote moving to the people. All right, click slide. Part of the progressives was a group of journalists known as muckrakers. And then people who called them muckrakers were the people who they were exposing their corruption, their incompetence, things of this nature. You had guys like Lincoln Steffens and Ida Tarbell. Steffens wrote a book called The Shame of Cities, which uncovered corruption and bribery and graft in big city politics. All right. Ida Tarbell, who was a teacher, by the way, wrote a book called The History of the Standard Oil Company in 1904, which exposed Standard Oil's monopolistic and predatory business practices. We talked about horizontal integration in the last chapter, how Standard Oil would simply buy up anyone who might be a competitor with them and absorb them into Standard Oil. Between the two of them and other muckrakers, they basically brought to the people's knowledge, some of the things in our society that needed to be fixed. And as a result, the people and their outrage and, their desire for justice and law began to push for the government to change how things were done. Click slide. Roosevelt becomes very quickly known as a trust buster. And we talked about trusts in the previous chapter. It's a word for monopoly, another word for monopoly. Roosevelt felt that some trusts were good trusts and they could operate, but other trusts, ones that were operating outside the law, or twisting things up, not allowing for competition, he began to pass legislation and push through already existing laws, basically giving them teeth, like the Sherman Antitrust Act. We talked about that, how it was a paper tiger, couldn't really do anything it was supposed to do. He begins to force these companies to break up into smaller companies so that there can be more competition. More competition is better for the population because you don't have to buy your product just from one person. Now you have options, and these different companies will compete trying to get your money, so they will, make better products. They'll have sales. They'll offer you deals on their products, things like this. You don't just have to go to Food Lion. You can go to Harris Teeter. You can go to Piggly Wiggly. You can go to Publix. You can go to that weird German one where they sell skill saws next to pantyhose, next to canned food. Lidl, whatever it's called. You get the idea. All right, there are options. One of the first ones he went after was the railroad companies. The Sherman Antitrust Act, that's where it gets its teeth, and basically the railroad companies are broken up into smaller railroad companies competing against each other. Also, the Pure Food and Drug Act is pushed through during this time, which basically made it so that you didn't open your can of Spam and find roaches in it. Things like that. All right, these are all things that Roosevelt pushes through. Click your slide. Roosevelt is also a huge conservationist. We talked about how he loved the outdoors. He grew up knowing that, natural resources had to be used. But at the same time, they couldn't be exploited. The quote we have on the top of this slide, conservation means development as much as it does protection. I recognize the right and duty of this generation to develop and use the natural resources of our land, but I do not recognize the right to waste them or to rob by wasteful use the generations that are to come after us. All right. Roosevelt establishes the National Conservation Commission, which is the first, I guess you could call it, an early form of the EPA. All right, basically setting aside federal land to be preserved as parkland, to be preserved in its natural state. He sets aside 150 million acres of forest to be kept in its natural state. They push through, under Roosevelt pushes through the Newlands Reclamation Act in 1902, which brings irrigation to the West. We talked about how dry it was in the West, how you basically had to pump water up from everywhere. Gifford Pinchot is the first commissioner of the NCC. Under Roosevelt, he sets aside 1.5 million acres of water power sites, establishing a lot of the infrastructure for water power that we actually still have today. So this stuff is over a century old in some cases. And he also established 50 wildlife sanctuaries and several national parks, including Yellowstone. All right. Click your slide. Now, Roosevelt's foreign policy is more in keeping with what we expect from Teddy Roosevelt. The Monroe Doctrine was passed, almost 100 years earlier. Not 100 years, maybe 75 years earlier. And it basically said that the old powers of Europe were supposed to keep their paws off of the Americas. That this was America's sphere of influence, and we would not tolerate interference in the Americas from the old powers of Europe. Roosevelt adds his own little twist to this, and they've come to call it the Roosevelt Corollary. Other people call it gunboat diplomacy. Roosevelt would actively send the U.S. military, the U.S. Navy, to act as a deterrent on these old European powers to keep them from getting their hooks back into Central and Latin America, to keep them from exploiting the native, the Latin American countries. They didn't really appreciate this. They thought it was America being high-handed. Roosevelt looked at it as, we're helping, but at the same time also promoting American interests. Like we just said, he didn't want the European powers getting their hooks back into the Americas. He also used the American Navy to force open Japan and China to trade. He sent an entire fleet of ships to Japan to basically force them to open their borders to trade. You can look at these two things and you can say, that's not exactly kosher. But again, that's just how Roosevelt was. One good thing he did was he negotiated a successful ceasefire between Russia and Japan during one of their wars. All right? So his foreign policy is somewhat mixed. All right, click your slide. But there's one thing that kind of just epitomizes how Roosevelt handled foreign policy, arguably the crown jewel of his entire administration. It's the Panama Canal. All right, click again. Panama Canal is a stretch of just a few hundred, not very far at all. Maybe 100 miles, if that. 80 miles, yeah. If you look at the little scale down there in the North Pacific Ocean slide. As far back as the conquistadors coming into Central America, they recognized that there was just some way to cut a channel from Cristobal down to Balboa. You could save yourself 8,900 miles of travel. You wouldn't have to go all the way around South America. You could just go through this channel and boom, you're there. All right? But the technology didn't exist until the late 1800s, early 1900s to even attempt to do something like this. There were two early attempts to build a canal. The French and the Germans both tried to do it, and both times they failed. If you look at the Panama Canal in profile slide picture, you can see how it works. You move into a chamber of water called a lock. It fills with water and it lifts you up. You move into the next lock. It fills with water and it lifts you up, and you move into the next one. All right. By this point, you're high enough that you can get into Guatan Lake. You go across the lake, and then you go into another lock, and the water level drops. You move into the next one, the water level drops. You move into the next one, the water level drops. You move to the next one, the water level drops, and then you move into the Pacific Ocean. You saved yourself 8,900 miles. All right, click slide. Roosevelt very seriously, after the last canal attempt, the last attempt at building a canal failed, Roosevelt seriously wanted to take it over. He approached the Colombian government about building the canal. They turned him down. Right? And here's Roosevelt being Roosevelt again. There is a group of rebels, Panamanian rebels, who want their independence from Colombia. All right? When the Colombian government turns down this $10 million lease for 100 years on the canal that America is going to build, Roosevelt turns to these Panamanian rebels. And he doesn't send American troops in, but he does send tons of money to these rebels to bankroll their revolt, which they eventually succeed. They're able to break away virtually bloodlessly on November of 1903. Only one person died in the whole thing. Panama declares themselves independence, and they accept the deal that Roosevelt had originally offered to Colombia. Now you can look at that and say that was some dirty politics. You can look at the little cartoon there. the Panama Republic hatching out of the egg of Colombia, all right, and offering Roosevelt the canal. Click the next slide. This sums up Roosevelt's whole attitude about how he got the canal done. I took it. The Panama Canal would not have started if I had not taken hold of it, because if I had followed the traditional or conservative method, I should have submitted an admirable state paper to Congress. Accordingly, I took the isthmus, started the canal, and then left Congress not to debate the canal, but to debate me. All right, and you can see a picture of him there at the bottom. He's sitting in a steam shovel in 1906 inspecting the work of the canal. Roosevelt basically did what we've heard people talk about doing forever. Rather than asking for permission, he did what he wanted to do, and then he figured afterwards he would ask for forgiveness. And he doesn't even really sound like he's asking for forgiveness. He's saying you can debate with me whether what I did was right or wrong, but I got the job done. All right. The new Panama Canal project, click your slide, is started by John Stevens, who basically built the Great Northern Railroad, which we discussed in a previous chapter. And it is a massive undertaking requiring thousands and thousands of men. It's finished by an Army engineer named Colonel William Goethals, who puts the finishing touches on the canal. And you can see from the pictures just what an epic undertaking it was to get this thing built. Next slide. 25,000 men died in the building of the Panama Canal. A lot of it was due to injury. A lot more of it was due to disease, our old friend malaria. Despite the best efforts of the engineers working the project and the doctors who were brought in, you still had 25,000 men die doing this. It's a staggering number. But then again, it was a staggering project, too. All right. Click your slide. Now, something like 3/4 of the world's trade over the waterborne trade over the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean goes through the Panama Canal. All right. You can see the picture there on the left. That is a battleship, quite obviously. I believe it's the Montana. If you've ever been to the North Carolina, down in Wilmington, you know how big she is. She's humongous. And you can see there, she's just barely fitting through that gate, just barely getting through. You had two gates, one to go north and one to go south. And it took, several hours to navigate through the locks and across the lake and to get from one ocean to the other one. They have, I believe, I'm not 100% sure, expanded it. I think there are 4 locks now, or 4 passages. But I am not sure about that. Now, in the 1970s, the lease on the Panama Canal, well, actually, we didn't even get through the whole lease. In the 1970s, the Panamanian government decided that they wanted to assume control of the Panama Canal. And the president of the time period, Jimmy Carter, decided to let them have it. But with one exception. The United States, because this thing is so completely vital to trade. You can look at that picture at the bottom and see just how much trade goes through the Panama Canal. The United States unequivocally reserves the right to defend the canal. If it looks like there's anything going to be a threat to the canal, the United States military will intervene in a heartbeat. All right, click your slide. This is a little bit repetitious. This is more of what we've already talked about. This is Roosevelt's foreign policy, his enforcement of the Monroe Doctrine. But it's an evolution into what they call the big stick philosophy or policy. Roosevelt's use of the Navy to enforce American policy is going to set a precedent that will be followed right up until this day. Anytime the United States felt like a foreign power was exerting hostile force in the Americas, and it will rapidly evolve into anywhere in the world over the next 50 years or so. The idea that we could very rapidly send in our Navy to basically show whoever was out of line. You really want to think about this. You really, really want to think about what you're about to do. It becomes American foreign policy, or a huge part of it anyway. All right? You see the picture of the big stick in the Caribbean. Click your slide. This is, again, a little bit repetitious. Just, showing the big stick. The one cartoon shows Roosevelt as the policeman. Again, he was a chief of police in New York City. He's got his big stick, and it says the new diplomacy. All right? And you can see he's standing between the old powers of Europe and the Latin American peoples. And you can kind of see that they're basically being sort of characterized as helpless and pathetic, which they did not appreciate at all. All right? Click your slide. The expression, the big stick, comes from a West African saying, if you speak softly, if you speak softly but carry a big stick, and you will go far. Basically saying, don't pick a fight, but absolutely be prepared to fight the fight if you've got to. And for the next 50 years, the American Navy will be our big stick. Arguably now you can say it's the Air Force. It's still the Navy is still pretty big. All right. Click your slide. And again, we see some of the things that the big stick diplomacy did. The Panama Canal, the defense of the Dominican Republic from hostile European powers who were trying to economically exploit them. The end of the Russo-Japanese War. The Great White Fleet, which forced open Japan's borders to trade. All right, so on and so forth. Click your slide. The election of 1908 rolls around, and Roosevelt decides to step aside. He probably could have run again and won again, but he decided to follow the precedent of 2 terms set by Washington. His vice president, William Howard Taft, steps forward, and there's William Jennings Bryan again. This guy just won't go away. The cartoon kind of says it all. Most people considered that, if Taft won, it would be a continuation of Roosevelt's policies. And the cartoon, Bryan is saying, which one am I running against anyway? And you see that Roosevelt's just kind of dragging Taft along towards the White House. All right. Click slide. Taft beats the doors off of him. With Roosevelt campaigning for him and pushing him along, he beats Bryan 321 to 162. The popular vote's a little bit closer, 7.6 to 6.4, 51 to 43. And Taft becomes number 27 as you watch him roll by. But he's just a one-termer, 1909 to 1913. All right, click your slide again. Under Taft, a lot of Roosevelt's policies do continue. The progressivism that started under Taft continues. Taft is another trust buster. Breaks up 90 different monopolies in the 4 years that he was in office, which is actually more than Roosevelt did. During his 8, amongst the companies that he breaks up includes Standard Oil, finally brought down, and the American Tobacco Company. If you've ever been to Durham, you will see, everywhere you look around, something related to tobacco, and you'll see signs for American tobacco, this, that, and the other, just about every time you turn your head. That's because American Tobacco was headquartered in Durham, and it pretty much built Durham, and it put a lot of money into Duke University, too. So anything you see in Durham is going to have something to do with tobacco. All right, click your slide. Now, some other things that went through during Taft's administration, you can debate whether they were good or not. You had the establishment of the Department of Labor during this time period, which was a good thing because it establishes labor laws and helps push through a lot of things that the unions have wanted for years. Sets a standard work week, workman's compensation, overtime, things of this nature. A debatable thing during Taft's administration is you have the passage of the 16th Amendment. which basically establishes, and I'm saying basically a lot again, I basically got to stop that, sorry about that. It establishes income tax. According to the 16th Amendment, you have to pay your taxes, all right, every year. All right, click your slide. Election of 1912 rolls around, and it's a four-way race. You've got Taft running for the Republicans. Roosevelt decided he wanted to go one more time, and he forms what he calls the Bull Moose Party. So-called because when a reporter asked him, was he in physical shape enough to run for president again and to hold the office, he said he was as fit as a bull moose. All right. Woodrow Wilson runs for the Democrats, and Eugene Debs runs as an independent. Don't even worry about Debs. He doesn't even matter. All right. Click your slide. Wilson runs on a program called the New Freedom Program. He felt that social justice could best be served by the government when it got rid of special interest groups and made small business able to function more freely in a market where there was more competition. Free market economy, basically. Sorry. He's, like most Democrats, he's in favor of small business and the little guy. Roosevelt believed that, like we said before, some trusts were good, but wanted strong labor unions as well as trusts to be overseen by a good, strong government that would keep them in balance. All right. Now here's the problem: Republicans didn't know who to vote for. All right. Do we vote for Wilson or do we vote for? Do we vote for Roosevelt or do we vote for Taft? Not able to pick between the two, it split the Republican vote. And in some cases, unable to pick between Roosevelt and Taft, some people actually voted for Wilson. When the election rolls around, between, I think wanting a change of government, let's give the Democrats a swing at this and see what they can do with it, and not being able to decide between Roosevelt and Taft, the election was a huge, huge, huge landslide for Wilson. If you click your slide, you can look at it. He almost, but not quite, swept the nation. Taft, he got 2 states. Didn't do a whole lot. Roosevelt, he has a spattering in the Midwest and in the North, and everywhere else goes for Wilson. All right, and Wilson becomes the 28th president of the United States. All right, and we'll discuss his presidency and World War I in the next chapter. All right, hopefully I will have the new program in place in time to do the next video, and we can do the PowerPoint with the lecture combined, and we won't have to do this weird thing that we're doing now. I know it's probably inconvenient and aggravating. Do your questions as normal. Contact me when you need worksheets and tests. If you have any problems or any questions, please contact me. All right? Have a good one.